Michael Bonin, and welcome to the Palantir podcast, a broadcasting arm of GHG Palantir, a completely online Tolkien discussion group associated with the Grey Havens group out of Colorado. We continue our discussion of the Silmarillion today with Chapter 10 of the Sindar. This really is the catch-up chapter. It's the look behind the curtain and follow up and see what has happened in the rest of the world while we've been observing over the last many chapters what has been happening in Valinor. What has happened during the 3 ages of the incarceration of Melkor? What has happened while he has been corrupting the Noldor? What has happened while the trees are being killed, while the Noldor are rebelling? What has happened during this vast period of time? So we return to Thingol and Melian, who have wed and have formed their own kingdom in Beleriand, which is to the far west of what we understand as Middle-earth. And those who remained of primarily the Teleri, who are known again as the Morroquendi, the Dark Elves, become of their people. Also during this time, during the second age of the captivity of Melkor, the Dwarves awaken, or at least are made known and manifest to the Elves. We don't quite know when they awaken, but this is the moment where we definitively know they exist and that they interact with the elves. Again, it should be recalled that this is a story which is written from the viewpoint of the elves as opposed to men or dwarves, and so therefore we're seeing when the elves finally become aware of the dwarves. Now during this period too, it comes to Melian that there's imminent danger, that there are creatures in the wild who can make war upon them, as well as an understanding of the captivity of Melkor and the evils that he may or may not ultimately bring to Beleriand and their land and their people. And so you get the construction of Menegroth, the Palace of 1,000 Caves, which is the home of Thingol and Melian and their people, the capital of their land. And it is meant to be both a fortress and beautiful palace for them to live in. And they cooperate very closely with the dwarves who live in the Blue Mountains nearby. And it is a moment of great cooperation between the two races, a level of cooperation and a level of camaraderie that we probably will never see again among the elves and dwarves together. Now, as part of this, we also have the first battle, the first true battle in Beleriand, which occurs from the incursion of the north of the orcs and the beasts of Melkor, which cause a victory on the east in Osiriand and defeat on the west, on the other side of the forest which will become Doriath, separating Thingol from Cirion, who lives in the Thalas on the shore, which ultimately is the instigation for the creation of what is known as the Girdle of Melian, which is a protective barrier which makes it such that no one who comes who isn't known or who isn't approved by either Thingol or Melian can make it through, unless they have some power greater which allows them to come through, and this will be crucial later. Now, one of the things that's interesting here, which we've discussed before with relation to the elves and their separation and their journey toward the west and ultimately towards Valinor, is we see here the truly multicultural nature of Middle-earth. Before, it was primarily with regards to the elves and explaining what it means to be a light elf and what it means to be a dark elf, something that we have mythologically within our own primary world, but Tolkien gives explicit meaning to. The light elves are those who pass over the sea to Valinor and see the light of the two trees, and the dark elves are those who remain, those who live within the twilight of the stars. However, we have something similar which occurs here with the dwarves, who are called the Naugrim by the elves, and the Khazad by themselves. They are also called the Gonhirim, Masters of Stone, by the elves as well. And then we're given a listing of all of their homes, of their primary cities and palaces. You have their settlement to the north in Mount Dolmed, called Gabil Gothel. And you have, which is known as Belagost, also Mickelburg. Then you have southern of that, Tumun Zahar, also known as Nogrod, or Hollowbold. So we're given three gradations of culture, of language. We're given that of the dwarves, that of the elves, and which will later be understood as Westron, a common speech which Tolkien translates as English. And so we're seeing here the immense differentiation between cultures as demonstrated by the languages that they speak. What's interesting here too is we get to learn something of the character of the two races opposed to each other. You have the elves, who speak a version of Quenya which is growing further and further away from the Quenya that they began with, and which will ultimately be raised to almost a Latinized form in Valinor, towards Sindarin, which is primarily a phonic change. And then you also have the dwarves, who have their own language, their own speech, which they create and speak among themselves. The elves ultimately teach the dwarves writing, the Kurth, the rune writing, which we'll see in both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And ultimately teach the dwarves their language as well, whereas the dwarves, number one, the elves have a hard time learning the speech of the dwarves, but also the dwarves are unwilling to teach them. And so already there's something there that we can see as seeds of potential conflict, or at least we can see that there are things that the two races hold secret and hold unique for themselves. Also, when we look at this chapter of the Sindar, what we're meant to understand, or what this chapter is really trying to do, is give us as readers a foundation by which to understand the reaction of the Sindar when the Noldor appear at their doorstep. Because everything we're seeing here, from the foundation of Menegroth through the foundation of the Girdle and the First War in Beleriand, all is the backdrop from which we can begin to understand the sort of homecoming that the Sindar will give to the Noldor. And we'll see that in future chapters. Now from here, as a group, we discuss the nature of time yet again, and how we're to understand this period. How long has it been? How long are the ages, lowercase a, under which Melkor is in captivity? How long is a year in the cycle of the trees? We don't know. And again, we use this as a way of beginning to understand the difference between the Teleri, who remain in Middle-earth, who become known as the Sindar under Thingol, and how they function as opposed to the Noldor. The Noldor are in Valinor, learning pretty much everything they can, doing everything they can to get a hold of knowledge and create and craft and build their wealth and build their prowess, whereas the Sindar are largely content to be. Now, part of this we discussed as the nature of a person with an indefinite lifespan. There becomes a point at which tomorrow, or even next week or next month, becomes meaningless. Because in a sense, because time is limitless, time has no meaning. It's not to say that the Sindar are lazy, or the Sindar do not have the skill or the craft or the ambition that the Noldor do. Rather, they are content to live their life, not being proactive necessarily to better or to further their position. But one of the things we see is that they tend to be reactionary. The creation of the fastness of Menegroth is not due to a desire for wealth, a desire for prestige, a desire for beauty, although all those things are a result of its construction. Rather, Menegroth is built because of the intuition, the pushing, the prodding of Melian, and the worry over potential danger yet to come. Again, the girdle which Melian creates is due to the incursion of the orcs and the beasts of Melkor, rather than due to a desire to fence themselves out, or fence others out of their realm, or to mark their territory. Rather, it is a reaction against the dangers of the world that they see. And so rather than grasping, constantly grasping towards achievement, the Teleri, the Sindarin who remain, appear to just subsist in a state of contentment, working towards a future, but not in the same grasping and ambitious way that we see from the Noldor. Now, when we had this discussion in our meeting this morning, what came out of it was this idea of, okay, why are the Noldor so different? Why do they then seem so ambitious? Why do they seem so proactive? Well, perhaps it is due to their relationship with Aule, who has helped them craft and learn craft of material. And as we heard with Aule in the very beginning, describing his power and his desires and his pleasures lie in craft, in the act of making, not in what is made. And yet when you compare that with the Noldor, yes, initially they begin with the same pleasure in the gaining of knowledge, in the furtherance of craft, and in the act of making itself. However, they are ultimately corrupted into a state where the things that are made ultimately become just as important, if not more so, than the act of creation itself. None more so than in the case of Fëanor, who ultimately goes crazy and completely off the deep end for the sake of the things that he created, the Silmarils. Now, granted, as we've argued, there are mitigating factors. There's the death of his father. There's the fact that he has been exiled from his people, rightly or wrongly. You can argue either way. There's the fact that the trees have been killed, and the Valar themselves have asked for the Silmarils to revive them. So there are mitigating factors, and yet the core of the corruption of the Noldor, in part, and what sets the fire blazing, is this focus and this value they place on the created and on maintaining possession of that created element over and above any other concern. And this is a corruption of their purpose, of their skill, and of their desires. And this is perhaps the biggest corruption, or the pivotal corruption that is made by Melkor. Now, too, one of the interesting things in this chapter is we get a lot of expository information. This is the chapter to kind of set you as a reader on a firm foundation to understand both the societal and the political state of Middle-earth, of Beleriand specifically, at this point in history when the Noldor have just arrived. This is the place that they are coming to, this place that they claimed in Valinor was empty and waiting for them to come and form their own kingdoms over which they could rule. Well, surprise, surprise, there are kingdoms here already. There are peoples here already, and have been here for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. Also here, we get another seed of interesting information about the Dwarves. A couple of things. First of all, it is stated that they hated the sound of the sea and feared to look upon it. Now, when I first read this, I thought, okay, well, what might this mean about the relationship between Aule and Olmo, and might there be something there about the makeup of the Dwarves and about how they were created that leads to this repulsion? And yet I think the argument that one of our members came up with is perhaps much more powerful and much more interesting. It is rather the idea that the Dwarves were made for a condition of living in a solid and an enclosed environment. They were made for that condition, and therefore they do not like the sea because it is not that condition, and feel the opposite of a claustrophobia, as well as being in a place where it's a material that they cannot use, as opposed to stone or metals. So too, with the elves and dwarves, we see the cooperation that is built around the building of the palace of Menegroth. And one of the interesting that comes here is the statement that they gave their skill and their craft willingly, for they were unwearied in those days and eager for new works. And though the dwarves ever demanded a price for all that they did, whether with delight or with toil, at this time they held themselves paid. For Melian taught them much that they were eager to learn, and Thingol rewarded them with many fair pearls. What's interesting about this is the fact that they both work in concert with each other, in complete cooperation, with no real feeling of needing to be paid or to pay. They do it out of the pleasure of the work on both sides, as opposed to what we will see later, which is the complete opposite and the complete breakdown of this relationship. It is rather a sharing of friends as opposed to some kind of transaction. Now from here we moved on to again discuss the character of Fëanor and how he grew to be what he became, which jokingly we've often described and thought about the nature of his relationship with his mother Muriel, and how she essentially would go off and die of exhaustion due to the overactivity and due to the terrible toddler that Fëanor probably would be. However, as we've discussed towards the beginning with the music of the Ainur, we thought too about the nature of Fëanor himself. In the Ainulindale, there are moments which are described in the Rebellion of Melkor, which are described as moments in which it aligns with the theme of Iluvatar, creating moments of great glory, of great consonance, and of great harmony. And in those moments are created some of the greatest beauties of the world and of Iluvatar. And might this be a way of defining the nature of Fëanor, and that he is created as a being with the greatest potential for good as well as the greatest potential for evil, and that this is something that is in the cards from the music and is used as a way to explain then how he is an elf of such incredible strength and being to force this colossal shift in the nature of their history. Also in this chapter we get a brief interlude which describes what we are led to believe are the creation of the orcs and how they were made. Now this is something that there isn't any real definitive answer for where they came from. In this case we are told that they've come from the north, and whence they came or what they were the elves knew not then, thinking them perhaps to be Avari who had become evil and savage in the wild, in which they guessed all too near, it is said. Now what's interesting here is the phrase is couched in doubt. It's couched in such a way that you can read this and yet not be certain. This isn't the answer, but it is thought to be the answer. And we can remember from the awakening of the elves at the shores of Cuivienen that during that time Melkor came and stole away elves, and so we have some level of foundation to understand that there may be some truth to this, that the orcs are corrupted elves that have been taken away. And we don't know. We get that one phrase, "it is said," which casts doubt over the entirety of the previous sentence. And one of the things that we came upon in our discussion is that this was a furtherance of that idea of the literary conceit that Tolkien uses, that this is a found or an observed and narrated history. And that therefore, when he's saying this and couching it in the term "it is said" or couching it in doubt, it is something that he has heard through hearsay. It is something that isn't definitively known and furthers that idea of this being historical knowledge that is formed based on mythology, formed based on what the culture has said or understood, as opposed to pure fact. And this is something we see throughout. In the previous chapter with Fëanor and the Noldor going to the north in order to find where the sea separating Valinor and Beleriand is narrower, the center point is described as being the girdle of Arda. Well, Arda in this period of history is flat. So why would you describe the center or the equator of the world as being a girdle, which implies roundness? Well, one of the things that comes out of reading the history of Middle Earth is the idea that Tolkien was very conflicted with the nature of Arda being flat versus round, and whether it should be round from the very beginning, whether the sun and moon should be there from the very beginning, and how that all worked in terms of a scientific understanding of the physical nature of the world. And in doing this, in keeping Girdle in place, may seem a mistake or a vagary of time in terms of when Tolkien actually wrote that particular chapter, but it also can be a testament to the genius of using the literary conceit of a historical narrative, because then you can look at the use of the word girdle from the standpoint of it being written by an elf in a period when the world is round, and therefore projecting the current state of the world onto the past. Now, we didn't quite complete this chapter of the Sindar, so we will return to it next week, along with one of Tolkien's arguably most poetic works of the creation of the sun and moon. Until next time.